the Red Rectangle Nebula. First discovered in 1973, the Red Rectangle Nebula is a particularly unusual formation that's around 2,000 light-years away from Earth. It had long been known that there was a binary star system in that region of space, but it was only when it was properly imaged that scientists realized that this was a stellar object like no other. It's a surprisingly symmetrical bipolar nebula that almost looks like a cut gem floating in space. The main star at the center is in the last stages of life and is ejecting huge amounts of material, including polycyclic hydrocarbons and silicate-rich dust, which are responsible for its red color. The ridges too suggest the star has been releasing matter in pulses, which have been shifted by interstellar winds, and the closeness of the ridges towards the center implies that the process is increasing in speed, and it may not be too long until the star finally dies. What's mysterious about the Red Rectangle Nebula, though, is that most evidence that's needed to understand how it formed is hidden behind the nebula itself, so the current theories about its existence are nothing more than an educated guess. It's now being constantly watched, though, so if any changes do occur, scientists will be ready to analyze the new information. Number 9. Peggy. The Earth's moon was formed in the nascent stages of our planet when a massive impact with another stellar object caused a huge amount of material to detach and form into its own piece of rock. But not all moons are formed this way. Some are meteors that have been captured in orbit of a planet, and others simply form in place, a process that had never been seen before until 2013. Near the edge of the rings around Saturn, a small 1.2-mile-wide formation was spotted because it reflected a lot more light back than the dust that surrounded it. Astronomers were excited to find that they'd be able to witness a moon being formed, but these hopes were dashed in 2014 when images failed to find this new moon that had been called Peggy. The following year, when the Cassini probe took images of the rings, Peggy was once again seen, but this time it was a lot smaller and there was a large rock orbiting very close to it. It's thought this must mean that Peggy collided with another piece of rock and broke in two. Peggy has now moved further into the rings. It's thought likely that it'll contact a lot more material with the ring itself and potentially become 2 or 3 times the size it is now over the course of a few decades. Or it'll be broken up and returned to the dust from whence it came. As the formation of a moon like this has never been documented, no one's sure quite what will happen. We're constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. Faces on Mars. In the early days of space exploration, a NASA probe called Viking 1 was orbiting Mars to take photos to help Mission Control decide on a landing spot for Viking 2. When the images came back, the world was stunned to see what looked like a giant face that was almost 2 miles long as protruded from the ground in a region called Cydonia. This obviously fueled speculation that it was an ancient monument built by inhabitants of the Red Planet, because how could something like this occur naturally? Those working at NASA already suspected the truth was far less exciting, that this was just a Martian mesa, of which there are many, and that shadows just so happen to make it look like a human face. They also felt that releasing the images would ignite public interest in Mars, which they did, and the face soon became a pop icon in its own right, featuring in countless books, magazines, and TV shows. Despite knowing it was just a coincidence, the mesa was a top priority site for imaging when the Mars Global Surveyor reached the planet in 1998 and again in 2001. To everyone's dismay, these new higher resolution images simply showed a large landform, and all signs of human features were nowhere to be seen. Number 7. Magnetic rogue planet. Planets are formed when disks of material orbit around a star and coalesce, but it's always been a mystery what happens to them when a star dies, or whether it's possible for one to form outside of a solar system. So-called rogue planets have long been a top target for researchers, but the fact that, if they exist, would be in the deep recesses of space without any light sources, it's almost impossible to actively search for them. In 2017, though, astronomers announced the first such discovery, a planet called SIMP 0136. It's a brown dwarf, so is somewhere between a planet like we normally think of them and a star, and is thought to be around 12 times the size of Jupiter. Thought to have originated in a nearby group of stars, but there's one thing that's particularly stood out about this discovery. Researchers noticed that it produced its own auroras, similar to the ones that we see on Earth, which meant that it must have its own magnetic field. Wasn't known for sure whether this was possible, especially for an object that had been adrift for so long, but the mechanisms behind its occurrence are still not understood. Number 6. Elst Pizarro. Apart from planets, moons, and stars, the objects that are most commonly seen in our solar system are comets and asteroids. The two types of objects are distinguished by their properties. with comets being made up of ice and rock that release a tail of vapor when they're warmed up by the sun, and asteroids consisting of rock and, in effect, being miniature planets. While virtually every object that's been discovered has fit into one of these two classifications, Elst Pizarro is the exception to the rule. First recorded in 1979, it was designated as a minor planet with a stable orbit in between those of Mars and Jupiter. But the more it was studied, the stranger it turned out to be. It's now regarded as both an asteroid and a comet, since it behaves like an asteroid and is orbiting where other asteroids come from, but at the same time develops a tail during certain parts of its orbit. This raises further questions because it could signify the presence of water in the asteroid belt, which may provide clues as to where the water on Earth came from in the first place. The plan currently is to launch a probe in 2028 that will be able to land on Elst Pizarro 5 years later, and if it's able to collect the right samples, it could even provide a deeper understanding for how our planet, and perhaps life, developed. Number 5. Haumea. When the decision was made to demote Pluto from being considered a proper planet, it seemed like quite a major step to take. In reality, though, it was because astronomers were only beginning to understand the objects that existed in the Kuiper belt at the edge of the solar system, and it became clear that Pluto was just the first one of these to have been discovered. There are far more mysterious objects in that region of space, though, one of which is called Haumea. It's an oval-shaped dwarf planet that's about a tenth the size of Earth, with a diameter of 385 miles, and has 2 moons of its own. Interestingly, a day on Haumea lasts for just 4 Earth hours, which makes it one of the fastest spinning objects in the whole of the solar system. It's about 43 times the distance from the Sun as Earth is, which means it takes light more than 6 hours to reach it. It takes 285 Earth years to complete one rotation around the Sun. But what's not clear is how it formed in the first place, and why it's such an unusual shape. Normally, objects that form when material combines together will become spherical, and it's very rare for something to spin as fast as Haumea does. It's therefore thought that it was subjected to a large collision at some point in history, one that changed its shape and speed forever. If Haumea is anything to go by, the other objects in the Kuiper belt are likely to be just as strange, which makes it one of the last uncharted regions still to explore in our nearby stellar neighborhood. Number 4.